Well, welcome everyone. My name's Ken Brotherston. I'm Managing Director of Talent Partners. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar, Protecting the Diversity and Inclusion Agenda During the COVID Crisis. Rarely has anything we've done been more timely or relevant. So I'm delighted to welcome you here this morning. I'm going to just do a quick introduction to explain a little bit about who we are and sort of what you're in for. For those of you that don't know, Talent Partners is a sort of market and business intelligence company. We work purely across the talent ecosystem. And what that means for us is we engage with employers, who are probably our biggest audience, also a range of kind of HR and talent technology providers, kind of RPO and outsourcing businesses, and then the traditional agency market. And we bring together different combinations of those groups to talk about a whole range of talent issues, and that can be around talent acquisition, but also talent management, with, I guess, our overarching mission of helping employers find and keep the people that they need. 3 years ago, we launched a benchmark program. It's increasingly obvious, I think, not just to us, but organizations more widely, that how they attract the talent they need is a kind of strategic issue for them. If you do it well, it goes a long way to helping you meet your business strategy. If you do it badly, it can fundamentally affect it. So we wanted to look at how organizations do that, and we broke the resourcing function into 11 different areas. And we do a very kind of thorough benchmarking exercise to help employers understand how well they do across those areas, and to then confidentially compare themselves to a cohort of competitors, and then also the market more widely. And it helps them just understand where they need to focus their resourcing activities. And in these days of increasingly tight budgets and financial challenges, being able to understand that is incredibly important. And as part of that, a few weeks ago, we did a survey, and we went out to a range of different employers, and we asked them to rank on a scale of 1 to 10, what's important to them and what's urgent across the 11 different areas of the benchmark. And sorry, that's just some of the organizations that are participating this year, just to give you a sense of who it is. But the TA priorities work showed some things that we predicted, which is candidate experience and employer brand are always seen as urgent and important, and that's not really changed. But the area that had changed quite dramatically was diversity and inclusion. So for the last 3 years, that has been always in the top 3, sometimes top 1, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, but always in the top 3. And as you can see here, that's really a marked shift from what we'd seen before. So still seen as important, but clearly seen as much less urgent. And the survey itself didn't go into an awful lot of detail, so we wanted to explore that in more detail. So we decided to put together a webinar and invite an expert panel to explore what this means, and perhaps more importantly, to come up with some practical solutions and ideas and tips and tactics for making sure employers keep diversity and inclusion at the heart of their corporate agenda. So our panel today is incredibly distinguished. The one thing I will say, the more eagle-eyed of you will spot that Asif Sadiq, who's the head of diversity and inclusion for Adidas, was originally scheduled to join us. He was invited to attend a global board meeting at Adidas this morning, and not surprisingly, he decided that was slightly more important. However, we're delighted that Zahir Ahmed from EY was able to step in at such short notice, and Zahir is a very experienced D&I professional. So welcome to all of our panel. They will introduce themselves to you properly in a few minutes. So our agenda is, in a few minutes, we'll ask Joe from Green Park to spend about 15 minutes just sharing with us some of the work they've done across this whole area, and drawing out some of the sort of key findings and conclusions. Alistair from Arctic Shores, and for those of you that don't know, Arctic Shores are one of the UK's leading behaviour-based psychometric assessment businesses. And Alistair's going to talk specifically around some of the issues around assessment, because that was a big area that a number of you had raised. So he's going to make a few remarks on that. And then Sarah and Zahir are then going to make a few comments and remarks about what they find within their organizations and what they're doing to help ensure that the D&I agenda sits practically within the wider business strategy. So that's the plan. We've got about an hour. What I'd ask you to do is to get involved. There's a comments button that you can make if you just want to make remarks and observations to everyone. If you want to ask specific questions, then hit the question button, and I will then moderate those to either, if I need to sort of interrupt the speaker, I'll do that. If I think it's better to wait until we get back to the wider discussion, I'll do that. But we'll try and do our absolute best to make sure we cover everything that we need to on the time that we have available. And before we get started, I wanted to make a point about the George Floyd thing, because the actual act itself was obscene. But what I found incredibly disturbing is that his colleagues stood by and did nothing. And what kind of putrid organizational culture allows that to happen? And I just found that incredibly upsetting that they allowed that to happen and showed complete indifference, as well as obviously the act itself. And so as a kind of almost hideous example of why having diversity and inclusion is so incredibly important, I think that's kind of what that said to me, that this is so important, it's so profound. So yeah, I just wanted to make that observation as we move on to our experts. So thank you for joining us, and I'm going to be quiet now and hand over to Joe. Joe, all yours.
Okay, I'm just going to share my screen, if you bear with me one moment. Okay, Ken, would you like to give me the thumbs up if you can see what I can see?
There we go, thank you.
Hi. So firstly, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining. If like myself, you've been inundated by webinars, we appreciate your time is very precious, and thank you for choosing this one. I want to start by not going into a lot of detail, but just to do a very quick introduction to who I am. I'm Jo Heath. I lead a dedicated practice at Green Park. I'm a partner within the firm, but I lead a consultancy that looks after diversity, inclusion, culture and ethics. I think just to set the scene before I begin with some of my findings, I've been working in this field now for about 18, 19 years, and over the last 10 specifically, particularly working through sort of talent, equality and employment law, what I'm seeing is this is exactly the type of stuff we see repeat itself at times of crisis, and that could be economic crisis. Of course, we haven't ever seen a health and an economic crisis on this scale, but this is quite a normal situation to revert back to less urgency. And I'm going to talk to you about my thoughts on that. The other thing I want to do is acknowledge that, of course, operational priorities tend to take over in terms of the key priority for the business, and that completely makes sense, and we appreciate the challenges, but it's just still so important to have a D&I lens applied to the work that we do. So let me kick off. So what I'd like to cover in this session, I'll have about 15, maybe just under 15 minutes with you, is to share some of my insights. So I want to make reference to the TA priority report, which Ken's touched upon. I also want to bring in some data from McKinsey, which is a recent report, which some of you would have of course seen, which I think is really reassuring and makes reference specifically to the impact of COVID-19. And then I want to share with you some of the work that we have done over many years in getting both quantitative and qualitative feedback. So we run a number of cultural assessments, and through that we interview a huge sample of individuals, either face-to-face, remotely or via survey, across diversity and across grade. And so what we get is a real opportunity to have some confidential feedback from them. And I'm going to share some of that with you anonymised, which I think really reinforces what we're seeing through this reporting as well. I want to share some practical tips, the sort of work I work with in terms of my clients to keep that momentum going all of the time. You know, sustaining D&I is a tricky thing to do. Forget crisis. It's just hard and challenging, and we acknowledge that. So I'm going to share some tips. And of course, I'll be part of your Q&A panel to respond to any questions that you have. And I have seen some of the advanced questions. I want to make reference to them within this as well. I think for me, in terms of exploring, you know, how is it possible that we can keep D&I to the forefront of our thinking, our strategic thinking, decision making? That's not easy at times like this. But again, I've got some techniques to share with you. And one of them is to sort of discuss the increasing of cultural intelligence at this time. And I'm sure many of you will have heard of this term that's on the call, perhaps not everybody. So I don't want to go into too much detail, but I do want to talk to you about the difference between that and unconscious bias, and perhaps present some of those topics to you. Okay, so in terms of key insights, I think that I guess it's reassuring to a certain extent that what we hear and what the TA report is saying is absolutely in correlation, albeit that's very worrying. So across the clients that we currently engage with and those that were leading up to COVID-19, we started to see this split of still there in terms of high importance, but definitely going down the priority in terms of urgency. And whilst we, again, as I've already acknowledged, support and understand the operational priorities, lots of these studies and the work that we're doing is actually stating some quite significant dangers. And that is that the good D&I progress that has been delivered to date is currently stalling, and in some scenarios actually reversing. And that's really quite upsetting, disappointing for all of us on the call, but particularly myself, who has worked so hard to sort of move this agenda on. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about disproportionality. And, you know, this is not necessarily new news, but I think it's a good platform to make some important and key reminders. The disproportionate impacts that we often talk about are already identified. You know, we can discuss them a little bit in Q&A, but we see disproportionate impacts across a number of groups when it comes to the hiring process, when it comes to performance management, employee experience and progression. And what we're seeing now as we emerge into the new working world is these are likely to intensify. And this is an absolute prime opportunity to ensure that doesn't happen. So I want to touch upon a few things. I don't think there is actually a diversity strand that hasn't been touched by this. So I can't cover all of them because, as you know, there is 9+. But what I would like to pick up on is 3, and that's sort of the Black, Asian, minority, ethnic individuals and employees we work with, those who have disabilities, and I'm going to focus on women. I think in terms of the Black, Asian, minority, ethnic piece, you know, we are acutely aware of disproportionality. It's heavily publicised, but it's still not rectified. And I think both in society and through this crisis, we have seen the disproportionality published in terms of those individuals who are likely to get sick from this disease and are experiencing severe impacts from the conditions of this. So I think that goes without saying, but what we're seeing is this is also rolling out when we're having to make important and crucial business decisions. So things like redundancies, restructuring, even promotion through this time. And what we're seeing is there is a disproportionate impact through that. And even in our own organisation, when we started to think about how we were going to respond to this crisis, furlough, perhaps redundancies, we had to start thinking about applying the D&I lens. because it is the case that for some organisations, the cluster and that the higher profile of Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups are in particular tiers, functions and grades within the organisation. And if we focus our restructuring activity in those areas, we could have a disproportionate impact. Now, that's not saying we don't end up making the same decision, but what we have to be mindful of is the D&I lens that needs to be applied almost as a secondary filter. Ken's touched upon the recent tragic events in America linked to the death of George Floyd. I don't want to go into too much detail. I'm heavily disappointed and saddened by all of what I'm seeing and reading. But I guess it's just again, a constant reminder that we think we have come so far, yet incidences like this remind us that racism is still so prevalent in our society. Actually, what I was getting calls about prior to COVID-19 lockdown was experiences that Chinese employees were having in the workplace when this started, and I guess not helped by the wonderful Donald Trump making certain references. And there was an increase in harassment for those communities. So, we absolutely see, again, this reinforcement of harassment and racist and discriminatory behaviour. In terms of disability, again, I think it goes without saying, but I want to start with a positive and a negative slant on that. The negative is, of course, if you have a physical or mental ill health impairment, this greater isolation period is very, very difficult for you. I myself are in a shielded category. It causes disruption to your hospital appointments. It affects your treatment. And actually, it's really, really quite difficult from an isolation perspective. However, from a positive perspective, and I have lots of friends and colleagues who have disabilities who actually feel that this is a good opportunity, because what we've been able to demonstrate is that remote and agile working does work. And so I think this is going to open up some opportunities for disabled people who require that flexibility and have now proved that indeed it can happen. And just finally, to touch upon women, I think the impact that we're seeing from school closures at the start of this, the fact that childcare has moved from the paid economy, the nurseries and the schools, etc., and the childcare, through to you then having to make a decision who's going to stay at home, we see that had an impact on senior women. Even if both people in the household, whether it was a same-sex couple or a man and woman, were having to take that impact themselves. It was the female, again, the primary carer that had to do the juggling. So I think that goes without saying. And finally, just domestic violence. It doesn't just affect women. Of course, we see that's not the case, but it does still have the highest majority, and that is up by 30%, which is very worrying. Okay, so what I thought would be good is just to show you some anonymised quotations. I'll let you read that at your own speed, but I just want to sort of simplify. We're hearing the first challenge from our clients is budget cuts and restrictions. And this is not new. D&I training, all things like that are nice to have, particularly when things are well, but they are seeing some sort of changes to that in the thinking when we go into crisis. And I think what this reminds us is that there's been a lot of work going on and it has now come to a halt. The second one, which I think is really quite worrying, is that there was an announcement made that gender pay gap reporting didn't have to be done this year, almost suggesting that it was too much work to do with everything that was going on. And I think that's quite worrying. And this quote plays to that it's actually sent out quite a negative message internally and externally, that it's perhaps not as important as it should be and it once was. The final one, there's two quotes here for you to take a look at, and I think this is what I'm seeing as being the biggest challenge, and that is that individuals and organisations are seeming to revert back to type, and that is that they may have invested quite a lot in D&I initiatives, in demonstrating their commitment, in perhaps undertaking unconscious bias training, which I'm going to touch upon in a moment, but there starts to become a disconnect And that disconnect is very much what we have said we support, we suddenly don't. And actually, leaders are reverting to just working with the trusted few in a panic that things need to be done quickly. So therefore, they're not investing in building broader relationships. And we are seeing that have an impact on engagement levels. Okay, so what can you do? What can we do? Of course, there are lots more grey to this, but this is quite black and white. But for me, what I'm seeing is organisations at the moment are falling into two camps. The camp that has truly had an integrated approach to D&I, and the camp that's very much had it as a standalone. And actually, sometimes organisations think they're in the top, but they're finding they're in the bottom there. And that is that they have tried to embed it through processes, through behaviours, through their strategy. And if they have done that successfully and effectively, then actually D&I becomes a business as usual activity. But if they have kept it more standalone, then of course what we're hearing is it's great, but it's just not something we can invest in right now. Again, I made reference to the McKinsey research. I think it's been quite powerful to see. They have stated that there is some really good wins associated with D&I, even in this bounce back. And those companies that are likely to invest and see D&I as a strategic priority are likely to leverage this and bounce back quicker. So that's a real positive. They are suggesting that those that seek this as a new opportunity to boost representation inclusion are going to see an increase in employee engagement, performance, and a better cultural outcome. And I think just to draw reference to the financial crisis that happened within the banking industry, you know, if you followed that story like I did and the outcome of that, what we see was a lot of the outcomes suggested that it was about lack of diverse thinking and lack of challenge. So actually, we really need to learn from past mistakes around that as well. The other thing just to touch upon is about re-socialising and enhancing the business case. You know, I and many of my clients have been overwhelmed by stats and business case XYZ. However, it's really important to refresh thinking on that. And what McKinsey revealed is actually through this time, so in 2019 going into 20, if you invest in gender diversity, there is actually an uplift from the previous research. So I think that was in 2017 and 2014. We can see we're now to 25%. Ethnocultural diversity up to 36%, so even better than was in previous research reports. And the sort of final thing for me is around the utilisation of data and insight. You know, this is, as an ex-auditor, I guess this is my bag, but I've been championing increased diversity data for a long time and transparency. And for me, if you are to make some business decisions with a D&I lens, it's simply not possible to be able to do that without data and without the ability to analyse that data. It also allows you to hold individual leaders to account for progress not being made. I'm going to just briefly touch upon this because I'm going to move on to my next slide, but I think there are these two areas are closely linked. Increase and enhance leadership capability. So for me, this is a leader's ability to engage and have courageous conversations and be transparent at this time. We talk a lot about unconscious bias training. I have a very personal and somewhat negative view of that and the effectiveness of that, which has been proven in recent studies. And so for us at Green Park, we moved our thinking around cultural intelligence as a tool to help remove bias. But of course, that's just behaviours. We need to also think about bias in our hiring process, in our succession planning, promotion and rewards. So just to finalise then, I don't want to assume that you don't understand this term. Many of you will have known and perhaps researched like myself, but I've been working on cultural intelligence for many years now. And for me, you know, as hiring professionals, we've got our head round. We need the component of emotional intelligence, particularly if we're appointing a leader that has responsibility for leading and managing big teams of people. I think it's less known the importance and the essential component of CQ, culture intelligence. So for me, this has been an absolute deal breaker for me as an individual, but also for the clients I've worked with. And this isn't about ethnicity. This is about anybody that has a cultural difference to you. That could be gender, that could be background, socioeconomic, whatever it may be. And I think it's a real differentiator at this time. The final slide for me then, and I'll happily talk to any of you if you want some more information, is just to understand a bit about the CQ component, and this comes from the Culture Intelligence Centre. There are 4 stages to increasing CQ. What I found really interesting about this is it can be improved. You can enhance this, and we've proved that from some impact studies we've done after we've developed people's CQ. You have to have a drive. You have to, as a leader, be interested and willing to understand different diverse settings. You have to be at least interested to know and increase your knowledge. The second is your ability to be able to understand different cultures and learn from people and engage with people. The most important parts here are 3 and 4. 3 is your ability to plan for the difference and integrate it in your approach. It's all very well saying, I really appreciate diversity, I like working with difference, but if people don't see that in your strategy or your actions, it falls short. And the final one is the extent to which you demonstrate that through your actions. So again, happy to pick up on any of that in any Q&A, but for now, that's the end of my session. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Joe. Really kind of wide-ranging and thought-provoking. So I'm sure we'll pick up on a few of your comments in the Q&A. But I wanted to turn over to Alistair. And as I mentioned, Alistair's a kind of assessment expert, and this was something that came up a number of times in the questions beforehand. How do you ensure kind of effective, unbiased assessment? With that sort of D&I lens in any kind of recruitment process, and obviously anything else that you think is relevant. So Alistair, over to you.
Thank you very much. And can you hear me okay? I'm just double checking before I get going. Good. Okay. And thank you, Joe. I thought it was fascinating insights, and I could talk to you all day about this. You raised many interesting points there, I think. As a quick introduction to me, I'm a business psychologist, and I'm UK General Manager of Arctic Shores. And as Ken said in the introduction, we are a behaviour-based psychometric assessment. What that means is we do things a bit differently. We don't ask questions of people. We get them to interact with some neuroscience experiments, and we're able to understand what makes them tick. And it does so in a very good way of eliminating adverse impact. I mean, just going back to what I'm conscious of time, and I could probably talk all day about this, but just going back to some of the things that Joe raised there about, reverting to the type and unconscious bias. And I saw a couple of questions flying into the chat box about it as well, sort of backing that statement up. The report that Talent have published, raises a really interesting question. Is diversity and inclusion really important, or is it something that actually gets dropped when we are in these austere times or strange times or whatever it might be? And I think the answer is both. And I think that's borne out by the data. It's still ranked as important, but the urgency gets dropped for whatever reasons. And I think unless we start really baking the D&I process, and assessment absolutely is part of this, into objectives and into the key processes, I think we're gonna always find this, that it gets deprioritized accordingly. I mean, if you think about something like health and safety, we design accidents out of processes, but they still happen. Well, bias is the same thing. If we absolutely work hard on making sure the process has as much adverse impact removed from it, then the better. And the way to do this, I'm afraid to say, and I say this as a psychologist, is to remove the human being. We work with a whole host of companies globally where, when we look at the post-campaign wash-up, you have technology solutions in there, whether it's video interview or assessments like the one that the company that I work for provide, or attraction tools, whatever it might be. When the human beings get involved at the end of the process, that's when you see a huge spike in biases creeping in and problems with adverse impact starting. So how can we rely on technology to help with some of those things? And I think the practical takeaways here would be is to really not expect a magic bullet, but actually to work hard on that design stage, that how can you utilize some of these digital solutions? How can you move things virtually, which is obviously a huge importance now in lockdown, but to try and remove three parts of bias. And those biases, I'd say, are the process itself. Are you using a tool that you know has problems with certain protected groups, whatever that might be? We know traditional assessments, for example, bias certain demographics depending on which one you're using. Interviews tend to bias certain people from certain backgrounds. So we know that can be something that is hugely process driven. And then the assessor bias. Are you expecting too much of your assessors? And more often than not, when I speak to clients, they talk me through a process where assessors are still expected to do an awful lot of assessing, and you end up being, assessment blinded by the amount of data that you've got to look at and the amount of candidates that you're looking at. As a quick aside, I mean, if you're ever unfortunate enough to end up in front of a judge, you don't want to be judged just before lunch or at the end of the day, because you will get a harsher sentence. And we know that the same thing happens if you're being assessed by a recruiter. And then the final thing, and this is where Arctic Shores, I think, are a little bit different with our approach, is that you can remove the self-report bias. So if you ask somebody a question about themselves, they feel the need to paint themselves in a certain picture. So if you say to somebody, are you driven, are you resilient, whatever it might be, there is a socially acceptable answer to all of these things. It's a little bit like, have you got a good sense of humor? Have you been practicing, the proper lockdown etiquette and self-discipline? We're all going to say yes, because we don't want to be the person that says, no, I haven't got a good sense of humor, and I haven't been practicing that social distancing. So can you remove that questioning from the process? Can you actually observe behavior rather than asking for it? Because you're going to end up with one of two things. One is, I'm lying to myself and I haven't the ability to perhaps judge myself accurately. And two, I'm starting to put the hat on of, well, what does this recruiter want to hear from me when I'm going through the process? So there are ways absolutely of designing that out of the process. There are absolutely ways of making sure that we can move things digitally. You can use digital technology, and it doesn't have to be punitive against people that don't have great tech. There are lots of solutions out there now that you don't need the latest iPhone or the latest computer to be able to operate it. So make sure that it has that accessibility to it. And then the final thing is, how can you help your assessors? I'm not sure I agree with Joe, right? I do agree with Joe. I'm sorry, that came out clear. I do agree with Joe. Unconscious bias training is, for the most part, almost worthless. And it's well-meaning, but perhaps doesn't land as well as it should do. So I'm conscious I've covered my 5 minutes, and I've covered a lot of territory there, and I'll let the other attendees speak, and then I can answer questions in the Q&A. But hopefully that was a quick rattle through of thoughts on how assessment can help. And like Joe, I'm very happy to pick up questions after this session.
So just before we let you off the hook, one specific question is there a kind of quick win? So one of the questions was, what's something I can do kind of quickly now that would improve, bias? I guess it's a top tip question, but
Yeah. So okay, I caveat this answer with I am a technologist and I work for a company that sells HR technology, but I would absolutely deploy tech to do this. I would remove the human being from the process as much as possible. My vision as technologist and business psychologist would be that the human being part of it is absolutely crucial at the end, and that's the point where you should use some kind of technology like the Arctic Shore solution, and others are out there as well, to do the heavy lifting for you. How can you go from applicants through to the final stages with no adverse impact being there? And we know that can happen with the process, and we know that tools are out there that can do that. So happy to talk about that with people if you want to. At that stage, you end up with a shortlist that is genuinely a shortlist, and you can flip the psychology round from the assessment process. And what I mean by this is, if I give you an option of 10, 20, 30 things, the first thing you do is start looking for issues with people. You don't say, let's look for the positives. You start with the negatives. It's a quick win. I don't want that. I don't want that. I don't want that. Think about a menu when you go for dinner. You quickly ignore the things you don't like, and then you focus on the ones that might be possibilities. But it's the same thing. If I present you with 2 options, you then start looking for the positives more than the negatives. And I think that is the crucial thing here. It's flipping the framing round, but using technology to do that. So my quick win would be, design the process that means you don't have the bias available in the first place. And I know that sounds quite a simple thing to say. It's not, and I'm admitting that, but that would be my quickest win. Use technology to get rid of it, because we can't change the human psyche that has been around for millennia, I'm afraid, overnight.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Alistair. Sarah, it'd be great to get your insights. And big international law firms, to those that don't know, aren't always seen as hotbeds of great thinking on diversity and inclusion. But actually, I happen to know that a lot of the top firms have been thinking hard about this for a long time and have done some really interesting and innovative work on it. So it'd be great to hear a bit about some of the things you do.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you for that introduction. I'm not sure about the bit around law firms, but thank you. Yeah, so I guess, I mean, a lot of the things that have been said, a lot of the things that you said, Joe, totally resonate with what I'm seeing, what I'm hearing. There's certainly a huge concern that diversity inclusion is going to slip down the agenda, off the agenda. The last recession, if you look back at the information that came out of that, it was very, very clear that there was a backward step in diversity and inclusion initiatives. The underrepresented groups were the ones who were most badly hit by the last recession, particularly the BAME community, particularly women. I think women at senior levels, there was a real backward step. So I think, talking to our clients, talking to peers, I think there is a worry about that. But then I think there's a huge group of companies, professional services firms who are very keen to keep this on the agenda. I guess our starting point is that we have got it baked into our strategy. I'm not saying our job is done, but it's very baked into our strategy, and there are two really key bits to that: people and clients. And I think those remain regardless of what's going on in the world. And actually, I agree with the McKinsey report. I think it becomes even more important once we get through this crisis, that actually we've got that focus. And we've got a sort of we call it the 3R approach. So I think resilience is where we are at the minute. And then hopefully we move into recovery, which I know everyone was hoping would be a real V shape, but I think it's now going to be more of a U shape. And then renewal is the final bit. And I think that's where the companies who've kept an emphasis on diversity are going to see real gains coming out of the crisis. So that's our starting point. When I'm talking to our leaders, that's where we're starting. I think I've concluded over the years that it's always worth restating that business case. There are lots of our leaders who totally understand our focus on this is because it's the right thing to do. But for those who don't get it in that way, I think restating the business case and reminding people every time you talk about these things why we're doing this is really, really important. I think there are a number of things that are happening at the minute. I think there are a number of real concerns around different underrepresented groups and how they will be affected. I think if you look at agile working, that's got some really interesting angles to it. I totally agree, Joe, with you. We're seeing the hit that women are taking disproportionately with all the homeschooling, and people are saying it's a bit like going back to the 50s, because everything that you've contracted out suddenly is coming back in, and so we are looking very, very carefully at that. I think for some disabled groups, actually, hopefully there's a big win coming out of this, that lots of people who previously had probably been told, actually, you can't do that job unless you can physically turn up in our location, are going to be able to challenge that going forward. So I think there are some dangers with this. I think there are some really positive things to come out as well with agile working once things are back to normal and schools are open, that I think we will see differences. But the key has to be, how do you hold on to those good practices and keep them, and as you were saying, Joe, not slip back to business as usual, which is a real risk. I mean, I think a couple of the key things for us is that we try and apply what I call a sort of diversity lens to everything that we're doing. So our COVID response teams internally, we made sure that those teams were a diverse group of people. And I think for organisations, if we can, we shouldn't be making any decisions where we haven't got diverse input into those decisions. And that's sometimes quite tricky. given the makeup at senior levels, but I think what it means is you need to bring in more junior people, which actually then really helps your talent pipeline. So that would be one of the first things that we're looking at. And for example, when we look at the appraisals of our staff, we apply a diversity lens to those provisional appraisal ratings. And you do it differently for different protected characteristics. For gender, it's pretty easy because our base of talent is pretty 50-50 male and female. And so you can see actually if the appraisal ratings are not falling out in the way that you would expect them to, and you can go back and revisit them. So it's really applying that check. I agree, any companies thinking of redundancy programs, you need to look very carefully at those criteria to check that there's going to be no disproportionate impact on any particular groups. And other thing that we've been doing with our leaders recently is a real focus on some tips around leading inclusively and things that they can be doing during lockdown while we're all remote, you know, looking out for the person in their team who maybe is not as visible as they might be when they're in the office, trying to avoid falling into that easy pattern of behaviour where you just give out projects to the person you know best or the person who you chat to most. So we've got some quite regular communications that go out encouraging people to really focus on that inclusive leadership. I mean, just one point on the unconscious bias. I agree with what's been said, and one thing that we've done that I think has been effective is to flag probably conscious decision making at the point that we're making really key decisions, whether that's promotion, remuneration, whatever that is. And what I've seen that do is two things, because you're doing it in the moment. Actually, I've seen people calling out their own bias and actually laying it out there on the table and saying, you know, actually, I'd like to defer to you on this question because, and then I found certainly if I'm in a group and it's an all male group and I'm the only female, it certainly makes it a lot easier for me to then call out if I think we're slipping into groupthink, or, you know, it makes it much easier. We often appoint someone to be devil's advocate in those situations. So I think, whereas the training on its own, I agree with everything that's been said. I think if you can bring that into the moment, that can have a good impact. So okay. I think I'll stop there and very happy to answer questions.
Well, I'd like to get some comments from Zahir and maybe come back in a second, Sarah. And one of the questions I would have is, you know, what are the, you know, some of the challenges you have in getting attention from, you know, you have a kind of disparate partner group, you know, they will have a whole range of their own challenges. So if you could maybe just have a little bit of think on that, and we'll come back. And the other thing is, I'm not sure to what degree your remit is international, but I'd be really interesting to get a perspective on kind of non-UK issues and whether there's either anything that we can, you know, learn from that or any lessons there. So if you can have a think about those. And Zahir, I guess, you know, it'd be great to get your perspectives on what you've heard already. And you know, your title is about delivery. So, you know, what are the things that you're delivering, and what are the challenges in doing that?
Thank you, Ken. It's a pleasure to be here, and many of the things that have been said resonates with me. Before I start, please feel free to stop me if I go on for too long. I feel like, you know, we need almost like a full day to talk about these things, if not longer. So, you know, I'm head of strategic delivery for UK part of EY. In addition to that, I lead on race, innovation, and thought leadership strategy, as well as being the director of our Future Leaders program, which is the leadership development / culture change program for our BME senior managers. So what I'm hearing, this is all external. I'll come on to internal in a second. People are worried, D&I professionals, and to some extent our HR and talent colleagues. I think there is a real worry about, I mean, historically, D&I has always been an under-resourced and underfunded department, in my opinion. So, you know, COVID has just added an extra lens to it. So to a lot of D&I colleagues, yes, they're concerned not about their funding and the budget, about their jobs. that, whether their department is going to remain the same size or in the future or not, as a result of the economic impact of COVID. And I think it's right to have that concern. And when I talk to leaders from small startups to global brands, I ask the same question. I think, Joe, you talked about this. Is diversity a BAU for your organization? Is it business as usual? Do you see it as business imperative? And the more often or not, the answer is not really. I think they do, but the practices and the processes they have to embed diversity within the organization and integrate it would suggest that they don't. I think it's, they like to think that they do, but in terms of tangible and measurable things they do, it's not. So yes, the concern is there within the D&I professionals, within the talent professional. Yes, people are absolutely worried about the budget cuts, restrictions, directives that they're dealing with, that they can't spend the money here or there. It must only be on essential or mandatory training, if you like. So that said, let me now turn my attention to EY. Now, before I go into tell you a little bit about what's happening in EY, let me deal with something right off the bat. We are not perfect. We haven't figured everything out. We're still on a journey to learn. However, I don't particularly have a concern in relation to any pending budget cuts, in relation to reduction of size of our team in D&I. I think we and this is something, I don't want to blow my own trumpet here, but, we have managed to sustain the momentum of D&I through these very difficult times, because we do believe it is a business imperative. It is absolutely embedded, integrated everywhere within EY. Our leaders have become even more visible, and for the right reasons, during COVID, to share their personal story. And Sarah, you talked about this, the sense of belonging and bring that to life during these difficult times. They've become even more visible. The focus has shifted slightly, and it's more now about the well-being, particularly the mental health of it, and also understanding that the working from home is not the same for everybody. We talked about, the women and the homeschooling, but we also have multi-generational households. We also have people renting, with people living with, with their relatives. When we apply, the BAME lens to it, particularly, and it does, it does occur in other cultures as well. But BAME lens, if you're a woman, you might be living with your in-laws, and it's not, always, you can't always, switch on your computer and start doing the work as you did before when you left the house to go to office. So the things we have done is we've given more voice to our communities, employee resource groups. I think they are a powerful vehicle to highlight how our colleagues are feeling, particularly the junior level colleagues. Tell our senior leaders and partners that one thing, but I'm very much focused on improving the quality of life and creating that sense of belonging for our junior colleagues. I think we talked about unconscious bias. I absolutely agree. I think the effectiveness of it. I don't think it's been proven. And there are various different studies, and the most recent one I saw was the Equality and Human Rights one. I think it's just that we do the training, we get people in, we tell them they're biased, they say thank you, and they leave. I don't think it works to fully eradicate bias. I like the point of technology, Alistair. I'm a big fan of technology, but what I ask myself is that we remove the bias from the human intervention, but the technology is also created, the artificial intelligence, all the sort of things that go into creating the technologies by humans. is there bias exist in that part of the process? So I think that's worth exploring. We're far too busy dealing with changing individual behaviors now that we're not keeping an eye on, the future, the technology. I don't want to say future. I think the technology is here. Artificial intelligence is here and is playing a big role in recruitment assessments. So that's something is worth considering. The final point I want to make is, whilst there is a huge shift towards virtual platforms, let's not forget there is a huge population that who do not have access to technologies. According to Social Mobility Commission's latest figures, 1 in 5 of our people in this country cannot make a video call. 1 in 7 cannot make a call because they don't have access to broadband and internet. So I think that's an important point to consider. The last point I want to make about EY is the PTR model, preference, tradition, and the I forgot the last one. PTR model. It's the, hang on a second. The requirement. So forgive me. So we practice PTR model pretty much in all of our processes and systems. Is what we're asking, particularly when it comes to recruitment, what we're asking, is it a preference? Somebody wants this person, the recruitment to come, for us to recruit a certain kind of individual. Is it a tradition? Have we always done things this way? Or is it a requirement, a necessary, non-negotiable condition or criteria? So I think this is a very simple yet very powerful model to apply, PTR model, preference, tradition, and requirement to which could aid our recruitment to be more diverse. Finally,
I'm keen to, because I'm conscious of time and I do want to get a few
fine,
more.
I'll stop. Absolutely fine.
We'll come back to you, but typically we'll have a number of people sort of leave around about 1 o'clock. So I wanted to make a couple of one point. There's been various questions about the content, and what we'll do is we will basically bundle up the various reports that have been referred to, the comments from today, any other research that we think is relevant, and we'll write it all up into one piece, and then we'll share that with you within the next few days. I would say early next week, because we want to make sure we capture a lot of the content here. So to all of you that have been making questions or asking questions around that. So I wanted to ask a question of the panelists. We've talked about this sort of, is it just a thing you do or is it embedded? What are the top, points, 2 or 3 points around either knowing when it is genuinely embedded, or what are the sort of, if it's not quite there, what are the top 2 or 3 things that you could do? So have a think about that. But Sarah, I'll come back to you with the question I asked a few minutes ago. I mean, what are the challenges in today's environment in making sure that you get the leadership's attention to make sure this is embedded?
Yeah, I guess there are a couple of things I'd highlight. I think data for us is really important. So we've collected diversity data for a long time. We've got pretty good response rates. And actually, you do get the attention of senior leaders if you show them some data, because I think often they hear a lot about diversity, they see a lot in the news, and they think that the job's done, or at least we're doing well enough. And I think if you can show them the data and say to them, well, actually, this is where we were 5 years ago, this is where we are now, often that's not going to be movement as quickly as you want. And so that has a big impact. And then secondly, for us, actually, I leverage the power of our clients. So, and for many organizations, there probably will be a parallel. So our clients are demanding this of us. And actually, that's also a very good way to get the attention of senior leaders and just really highlight the importance of doing it. And the data point goes back to employees, and we're a firm of lawyers. We need the best legal brains, and just logic tells you that if you're not fishing in a very diverse pool, you're going to be missing some of the best talent. Makes no sense.
Brilliant, thank you. Joe, I'll come to you in a second with that question about the sort of top tips for getting it embedded into an organisation, truly embedded. I just wanted to do a very quick shout out for our benchmark programme, because one of the areas that we look at is diversity and inclusion. And as an example, we ask, are the bonuses and career prospects of people in talent acquisition, are they tied to diversity and inclusion targets? And guess what? They tend not to be. So as that kind of external benchmark, I would suggest you have a look at our TA benchmark program, because we do try and explore, or we do explore some of the issues around how to build a better series of kind of D&I processes into your talent acquisition function, and it helps you understand where you are compared to the market. So that's enough about that. Joe, your thoughts on the kind of key things for making sure D&I is really embedded.
Yeah, it's a really tricky one, because it's certainly not one thing. And so just reflecting on what you just said, and also everybody else, I think it's a no-brainer that there needs to be a level of accountability to really see change. And often that's tied to performance management, having certain objectives set for leaders, the board, or talent professionals. And whilst I'm actually in support of that, for me, it's all about the diversity, inclusion, maturity of the organisation. So we work with organisations that believe they're truly inclusive. They've dropped the diversity and they just talk about inclusion, but they haven't gone through the process, the maturity levels to establish, yes, we are inclusive. They've just assumed diversity will come if we do this. So whilst I'm in support of ensuring that there are aspirations set that are measured through performance management, it has to be done at the right time. Because in my experience, we've observed some very strange behaviours going on of individuals that have had that put upon them. So it is about the maturity. I guess the point I just wanted to pick up was about the human element being removed, Al, and the technology. And I'm really in support of all of that, of course. However, what I'm fearful of is that we might just kind of push this issue down the line. And if we keep the entire recruitment process with no human intervention, what happens to the experience of the diverse professional that gets placed into the organisation? What's that environment like? If we're almost shielding the behaviours that could come out of the hiring stage, that'd be my fear. But just to finalise, what do I think needs to happen? I think it needs to be baked into strategy. I don't think it's sufficient to have a policy on D&I. It has to be a strategy. It has to have actions. It has to be baked in through accountability, through tracking and data, and also through behaviours and actions. And sometimes, to your point, Sarah, the stakeholder and investor interest and the procurement push now is really getting leaders to take note. And so pushing a bit more on the commerciality side, I think is getting more people on the bus. Not necessarily the right way. There's lots of moral and legislative reasons. But actually, if that's their driver, then I go in on that one as well.
Okay. And Zahir, I know you mentioned well-being, and I mean that I think is such an interesting topic, but it's a whole session on its own, because I think that particularly remote well-being is going to be a topic that is already important, but I think it will become increasingly so. But I'll come back to you for some final remarks in a second. But Al, I just wanted to get any final thoughts from you on the various points that you've heard.
Yeah, I mean, I think Joe makes a really good point there. I think there's no one magic solution to any part of this, and I think it's broader than just saying, oh, it's an assessment problem, or it's a cultural problem, or it's an attraction problem. I think it's all of them, and I think we need to work in a combined way. Joe, you're absolutely right. If we just heavily relied on technology, never had any human beings, that would be a terrible experience for candidates. And then you get this lovely diverse population arrive, and the organisation is not ready for them, or is not going to keep them. So it needs to absolutely be across the board. I think there are some, when we're looking for quick wins, I agree with you, it needs to be these incremental changes. It's like the Sky cycling team, you know, marginal improvements in every place start adding up. You know, I was talking to a client recently who was given the most unachievable D&I target given where they were and what they were trying to achieve. And it's like, well, no one was ever going to get near that, so everyone just didn't bother. So how can we set realistic goals to improve things and build and build and build? And I think it needs to be every single stage. It's not just one part of it. That would be ridiculous to think it would be. But I thought there's been some great points, and I would love to talk for longer, but I'm conscious of the time. But very happy to pick any of these sort of conversations up with anyone afterwards if they wish to.
Thank you. So Zahir, actually, that's a really interesting point from Al. I mean, what is your kind of, you know, best advice around, not every organization can do everything, in fact very few can do everything, you know, how do you prioritize what, you know, can and should be done in, you know, in the current environment, and perhaps you're thinking to, once, you know, the environment's a bit more stable, you know, how do you go about that?
I think again we are against the time, and there isn't a silver bullet in here that can fix all the problem. But there are two things, and one Sarah mentioned, and that is data. Data is powerful. You need to know where you are. You need to be able to measure. You need to be able to see where you're going, and if what you're doing is making an impact. But the second one, which I think is equally as important, because data doesn't always tell the full story, it needs to have a narrative. A narrative needs to come from insights collated from our colleagues through a number of ways. So to make a compelling case on diversity, I believe data, along with the narrative, that why we have that kind of data, you know, and what is our data telling us. There are two things. If I have to, I think it's very hard to pick two things, but if I have to on this call, with the time we have and the topic we've discussed, data and the narrative would be the two things I'll encourage people to focus on. Narrative that comes, insights that come from colleagues across the organization, not just from one cohort of people or one group of people, across the organization.
Okay, so we've still got a fair few people around, so maybe just one final question to all of you, and I want to finish on a positive, and I think the positive is around agile working. You know, I think this crisis has shown us that agile working is far more achievable than perhaps we realized, and particularly with a disability lens as well. So any observations on, you know, what you think organizations can do to ensure that agile working becomes embedded into their sort of common practices? Anyone want to volunteer? Sarah, do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, sure. It's a really interesting question, and I think, leading on from what Zahir was just saying, I think there's a lot about going out to all the people in the organisation and hearing from them a little bit, because I think there's quite a balance here. It's been interesting that some organisations have just said, right, we're going to work remotely now forever for the foreseeable future, and I think that probably works for a lot of the senior people in organisations, but definitely for us, it doesn't work very well for the junior people who need to be around more senior people to learn. Particularly for some of our lawyers, they learn by listening to other lawyers, and that's true of other disciplines as well. So I think there isn't a, you know, again, there's nothing that we can do quickly here, I don't think. I think we just need to reflect on what's worked well, what have we missed during this time, and then really try and remodel how things look and not use anything as a starting point. So I don't want to use how things used to be and tweak it a little bit. Let's just look at what's the best position. But I think certainly for us as a business, working remotely, you know, on a full-time basis absolutely isn't the solution. It's a lot more nuanced than that. So I think, you know, we need to hear from all our people, and we've been doing surveys already, hearing from people as to what they want, what they feel they can do, can't do, and then I think you need to put all of that together. So not an easy answer, I don't think.
Although on that point about the engagement with partners, in our little business, we have a kind of daily check-ins, and we'll have sort of half an hour in the morning. And actually, what we've found is the more junior people in the organisation are actually getting much more involved in conversations that previously would have been a meeting with other people.
Yeah.
So actually, that bit of it was a kind of unintended consequence that they're.
Yeah.
They don't know they're getting training. They're just part of a conversation that perhaps previously they wouldn't have been part of. So I think that's definitely been a positive for us. Joe, what's your sort of final few words on agile and remote working?
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, I think I agree completely with Sarah, and we moved 100 people to remote working, fairly small but significant for us, and didn't have a choice on that. As you know, we all had to do what we needed to do, and the impacts we've seen have been, quite uncomfortable, because we all made an assumption that everyone's going to want to do it. Of course, people want to do remote working. What they actually want is now and then to have flexibility. They don't want to be solely home-based. We have a mixture of people that live in London in house shares. Some of our staff have been living with other housemates who've had COVID, which has been concerning for them, and they do not have an office set up. They're kind of working off their breakfast bar with all the noise, etc. So we absolutely need to be strategic in the thinking of this. Also, there are lots of people from a wellbeing perspective who find the isolation really, really difficult. And the final point is, I completely agree with Sarah. A lot of it is teaming. A lot of it is that, that collaboration that you get when you're together, and the learning that you do with each other. So I think, of course, it's going to bring benefits. It's proved we can do it, but it absolutely needs to be strategically thought through. It can't be a blanket, let's close the office.
Dynamic working, that's the phrase that I'm hearing more and more.
I like that, yes.
It's far better than flexible working, but dynamic working. Al, any final comments from you?
I don't think so. I think Joe summed that up very eloquently. I think my big worry is that dynamic working, and I do like that, is just in danger of creeping. I mean, for me, I've got 2 young children. It's very easy for me to be flexible around their needs at the moment with homeschooling, and I tend to work at night and stuff like that. But I'm not sure I want that to continue long term if there's no office. That it's handy right now. So I think we just need to make sure that organisations are supporting people to have the downtime, to have space, to make sure they're using their commute not necessarily to work all the time, but actually to spend some time for themselves. As long as we're doing that and the wellbeing processes are in place, then I think there is definitely some amazing benefits, and we should encourage it. But I'm a huge believer that you need to be around people and with people, and that absolutely has got to happen at some point, whether it's part-time in the office or how we do it, I don't know, but it would be fascinating to see what happens in the next year or so.
I've always found the term work-life balance unhelpful, because it seems to presuppose that work is bad and life is good, and then somehow they're divisible. And in a knowledge economy, they're not. They're completely integrated, and finding that way of being able to just do what you need to do in life in an overall balanced way, I think is really the challenge. So Zahir, you were kind of last to sign up and join us. I think it's only fair that we give you the last few comments. So what have you made of all of this? What are your key bits of advice? Oh, you're on mute. Yeah.
Agree with everyone. The only point I would make is that the acknowledgement, I think Joe touched on this, that not everybody's got home office set up, not everybody has the means to set up at a home office. And I have spoken to colleagues who suffering from back pains, neck pains, because they've been sitting in their bed or leaning on their couches or sitting at breakfast tables. So I think, and I've read that some organizations are beginning to give allowances to people who wants to set up a home office and have the space to set up a home office. So I think, just acknowledge that, all those points are absolutely valid, but also acknowledge that, people don't have the means, particularly, our colleagues at junior levels, they don't have the space or the means to set up a home office and sit there for 8 hours or 10 hours like they used to. And the final point I'll make is the human interaction is absolutely key. If you're anybody like me, I want to get out of my house. I've got 2 daughters, and one of them is 3 years old. It's and at the moment I've bribed them not to interrupt or disrupt me, and I bet they're sitting outside my door waiting for me to finish this call. But human interaction is so important for so many of us. So let's not assume that the dynamic working and home working is for everyone. It may well not be.
No, indeed. Listen, we have packed an awful lot into our hour and 10 minutes, and we could go on. And I see there are a few more questions or requests for information. But as I say, we'll try and look at all of those and put a kind of package together that we'll send out to everyone just to help them think about this further and hopefully take some useful things into their own organizations. So really, I think for me, it just remains to say thank you to our panelists. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your insights and your wisdom, because data really is only the bedrock for kind of information, knowledge, and ultimately wisdom. And I think you've delivered that in spades today. So thank you very much for that. Thank you to everyone that's joined and given their time. We hope it's been useful for you. And as I say, we'll write it all up and share it with you. But I think that is it for now. Okay. Thank you, everyone. And we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.